They told her she didn't belong there, that this competition wasn't for people like her. The security guards barely looked at her ID before shaking their heads, giving her that dismissive, rehearsed smirk people save for beggars or lost tourists. Around her, the buzz of polished boots, tactical gear, polished weapons filled the space like a living organism. Competitors flexed, SWAT members strutted in uniforms too clean to have seen real action. Cameras panned the room, catching the confident poses of men adjusting their vests, their belts, their pistols, posing as soldiers but living like showmen. She stood quietly in worn sneakers, jeans with a small tear near the knee, and a dull gray hoodie. No sponsors on her clothing. No expensive shooting glasses hanging around her neck. The duffel bag she carried was old canvas, frayed at the seams. Every inch of her screamed ordinary. Disposable. Forgettable. That's exactly why they laughed. A SWAT recruit near the entrance nudged his friend, nodding toward her with a grin wide enough to show gold fillings. Look, she brought her kid's backpack. What's she gonna do? Throw pencils at the target. The laughter came easy to them. Too easy. Men trained in sharpshooting, tactical strategy, and coordinated assault were now reduced to schoolyard bullies in body armor. But she said nothing. Her expression never shifted. Just a glance past them to the far end of the hall, where the one-shot demonstration sign was posted. That's why she came. One shot. One opportunity. It wasn't ego. It wasn't about proving she was better. It was about something deeper. Older. She remembered that sound. The click of a rifle bolt sliding forward, the pause of silence before the world shatters, and the sharp crack of a bullet moving faster than sound. She remembered how that noise sounded echoing off tile floors, bouncing off plaster walls as screams rose in layers around her like waves. A child standing barefoot on a tiled kitchen floor, staring at the cracked wall across from her, not understanding why her mother didn't move anymore. That was the first shot she ever heard. But not the last. They didn't know that about her. They didn't know her father had been a competitive shooter before war stole his career and left him broken on the inside. They didn't know about the hours she spent not at school but at abandoned farmhouses, shooting rusted tin cans off fence posts with his shaking hands guiding hers. They didn't know about the rebel raid that destroyed her family or the soldiers who stormed her home, laughing the same way these men laughed now, while pulling her brother away in handcuffs, while dragging her father outside for execution. They didn't know that one of the officers leading this event was the same man who had given the order that day. The voice had changed slightly, older, rougher, but when you hear a devil command the death of your family, the accent etches itself into your bones. No, she wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here because of that one perfect shot. She carried it with her like a secret prayer. It wasn't revenge in the way people write it in cheap stories. It wasn't violent rage or loud confrontation. It was colder, sharper, precision honed not on firing ranges, but in the smothering silence of grief that never got spoken aloud. One instructor made a show of stretching exaggeratedly, lifting his rifle like a baseball bat, winking at the cameras. Watch this, fellas. Let's give the crowd a show before Little Miss Backpack takes her turn. Even the local press was in on the joke. The social media clips were already circulating before she reached the sign-in table. Local nobody challenges elite SWAT snipers. Followed by laughing emojis, popcorn emojis, flame emojis. Viral stupidity packaged in perfect modern cruelty. She signed her name on the form with steady fingers. The man behind the desk didn't even look up. He slid the form aside like someone clearing crumbs off a kitchen counter. Her slot was last. The joke of the day. The grand finale comedy act. Only she wasn't laughing and she wasn't performing. As she moved to the edge of the demonstration zone, she pulled the duffel bag open, revealing a bolt-action rifle older than most of the recruit. Wooden stock, scratches from years of weather, the metal slightly dulled with time, but polished at the grip. It wasn't military issue, wasn't sponsored, wasn't a product of advanced engineering or recent modifications. It was personal. A family heirloom dressed as an afterthought. Behind her, the cameras kept rolling. The instructor's voice filled the space, announcing names, qualifications, prior medals won, competitions conquered. These men wore their achievements like armor. She wore none. She only carried one thing into that room: memory. The sound of that first shot. The screams that followed. The realization that no amount of hiding or smallness could make her unseen by monsters dressed as heroes. They didn't know what it meant to stand still on broken floors with your feet sticky from your mother's blood, watching men load weapons like it was just another day at the office. They didn't know what it felt like to be a child made into a ghost before her body ever had a chance to grow into its full height. So, no, she wasn't afraid of their chuckles, or their jeering, or their polished boots clacking on the range floors. She'd already seen death in crisp uniforms. She'd already met the devil once. Today wasn't about fear. It was about closure. She didn't lift the rifle yet. She just stood there, still and steady, letting them talk, letting them bury themselves in their arrogance, letting them dig the grave their pride would fall into. One of them would recognize her soon enough. She hoped it would be him. She wanted that recognition before she pulled the trigger. Not because it would undo the past, not because it would heal what was broken, but because when that shot rang out, it wouldn't just be a bullet slicing through the air. It would be the sharp, final punctuation at the end of a sentence she had been writing in silence for most of her life. One shot. One name. One reckoning. The last time she had held this rifle, her hands were smaller, her fingers thin and unsure. The weight of it had seemed enormous then, too large for a girl who could barely lift schoolbooks, let alone the burden of memory attached to something designed for precision and death. Her father's hands had covered hers, trembling slightly from the cigarettes he never put down and the nightmares that never left. He wasn't teaching her to kill back then. He was teaching her to focus, to breathe, to steady something in a world that refused to stay still. Breathing was the first lesson. Aim was the second. Silence was the third. She had mastered all three before she turned 13. It was her father who had told her that shooting wasn't about violence, it was about discipline, about making chaos quiet for one heartbeat, about creating order where there wasn't any. That lesson stuck longer than his voice did. The world had a way of making men like him vanish, either into prison systems or shallow graves with headlines no one bothered reading. By the time she was old enough to understand the words on his tombstone, she was already older than most children around her by decades in experience, in grief, in weight. She hadn't fired a round in years, not because she was afraid of missing, but because every shot brought back that afternoon when the air smelled like burning rice and diesel fuel. They had come in laughing, wearing mismatched camouflage, boots slamming on loose tiles, rifles carelessly swung over their backs like props. She remembered standing near the doorframe as her father lifted his body in front of her. His body wasn't large, but in that moment it was all the shield she had. The men were loud. One of them wore a necklace of foreign dog tags like jewelry. She never forgot the sound of the slap that came first, then the words, "Where's the radio?" Her father didn't speak. She didn't speak. Her mother screamed. Then the first shot. Her mother folded into herself like a curtain falling in a silent room. No music, no warning. Just the wet slap of a body hitting tile, red spreading across the grout like spilled ink. That was the first shot she ever really heard, not at tin cans, not at rusted signs on abandoned farms, but at the soft, breathing form of someone who tucked her in at night. They didn't take the radio. They didn't even look for it. They took her father next. She never knew if he was killed instantly or dragged somewhere first. The only thing she remembered clearly was the smell of gun oil and sweat and the voice of the one giving the orders. The accent. Rough consonants, stretched vowels. Even as a child, she knew that voice carried authority because of how the others obeyed it. She carried that voice in her ribs like a hidden razor blade, tucked away but always sharp against the skin of memory. Years later, that same voice was on recruitment videos. It was dressed in medals and formal jacket. The same orders, now softened for public broadcast, but she could hear it underneath. The sneer in every syllable, the practiced control of someone who learned early how to weaponize language. She tracked his career not because she wanted revenge but because when you've been made silent by someone, you tend to keep your ear pressed against the door of their life, waiting for the crack in their armor to show. This competition was that crack. Public, broadcast, arrogant, perfect. She could feel that old nervousness clawing at the edges of her throat, but she swallowed it down the way her father taught her, not by force but by breathing it into stillness. You don't beat panic by pushing it out. You welcome it, then you sit it down in the back row where it can't touch your hands. The instructors here weren't soldiers, not really. They were performers now, actors in a state-sponsored play dressed in tactical vests with nothing inside but soft bellies and soft lies. Their boots didn't squeak from rainwater or swamp mud. They gleamed from commercial polish. They were the kind of men who signed autographs at gun shows, posed for selfies with local politicians, gave speeches about honor while pocketing private contracts. Real soldiers didn't talk that much. Real killers didn't need the stage. She wasn't here to speak anyway. She had spent enough of her life speaking to empty chairs and empty rooms, practicing sentences that never made it out of her throat. The school counselor said selective mutism was a disorder. Her uncle called it stubbornness. But they didn't know that silence is sometimes a weapon sharper than any blade, heavier than any bullet. It wasn't stubbornness. It was focus. Words got in the way of intention. The men around her thought she was a joke. One even mimed taking a selfie with her in the background, giving her bunny ears. They didn't know that they weren't standing next to weakness. They were standing next to the human embodiment of unfinished business. She carried the weight of unfinished sentences, unfinished lives, unfinished stories. This wasn't going to be another unfinished thing. This was going to be punctuation, crisp and final. It would have been easy to let anger take the lead. Easy to picture his face framed in the scope, to imagine what it would feel like to see his surprise just before the impact. But she didn't want easy. Easy was for people who forgot that true discipline wasn't about what you could do, it was about what you chose not to. If she came here just for vengeance, she would already be lost, just another broken survivor playing at heroism through violence. No, this was about truth. About dragging a lie into the light so it could be seen fully for what it was. The shot wasn't to kill. It was to expose. And exposure burns longer than gunpowder. They didn't know that her entire life had been shaped by the weight of unseen things. Invisible grief, invisible strength, invisible skill. They didn't know that she had spent her teenage years studying angles and trajectories not because of any school curriculum but because figuring out how things moved was the only way to make the world make sense again. Her hands didn't shake now. That surprised her slightly. She had expected some tremor, some old reflex from the days when she shook uncontrollably under a bed, counting each second between footsteps, between rifle reports, between the silence that always came after. But her hands were steady. Because this wasn't the past anymore. This was the ending she was owed. Not a scream. Not revenge. Just one perfect, undeniable shot. One statement that no one could interrupt. And when it came, it would speak for her louder than any voice ever could. The rumors spread faster than the event organizers could control. By the time the fourth competitor missed his shot and swore under his breath, social media feeds were already overflowing with clips of her face, her clothes, her rifle, her silence. Some posted laughing emojis, others made memes comparing her to cartoon characters carrying slingshots into battle against armored tanks. But a few started asking real questions. Who was she? Why wasn't she speaking? Why was her rifle older than the competitors around her? And why did the instructors look nervous when the camera caught them glancing in her direction? The SWAT candidates doubled down on the mockery. Arrogance is a funny thing. When confidence wavers, it usually tries to patch itself with louder laughter, bigger gestures, forced jokes. One of the recruits dropped his magazine during a reload demonstration, the metal clatter sharp enough to make him blush. Another struggled to tighten his sling. They were breaking, but they didn't know it yet. Pride doesn't notice the cracks forming until something slips through them. She stayed still, watching, waiting, measuring. Not just distances on the range, but emotional distances. The gap between what they pretended to be and what they truly were. And underneath all of it, she could feel the slow, growing tension of those around the edges of the crowd. Not everyone was laughing. Some of the junior officers, younger cadets, even one or two maintenance workers from the building, watched her with curiosity instead of ridicule. Not support yet, but something else, doubt. Doubt in the narrative they were being sold. The man behind the microphone kept talking. Credentials, statistics, former victories, the kind of hollow bragging that sounds important if you don't know how violence really works. He had the kind of voice that smiled even when his mouth didn't. The voice of a man who had lied under oath before. The voice of someone who learned that speaking confidently was more important than speaking truthfully. She knew that voice better than anyone here. It haunted every closed eyelid dream she had fought off for years. The things he had done couldn't be undone, but they could be dragged into the light, and this competition was going to be the lever she used to lift that rock. Behind the cameras, the organizers spoke in hushed voices, fingers dancing over touch-screen controls, monitoring viewer counts like stock traders monitoring falling shares. Something wasn't going according to plan. The ridicule campaign wasn't landing as smoothly as they hoped. Instead of pure comedy, the audience online was splitting. Some laughed, yes, but others were posting screenshots of her rifle, zooming in on the wear patterns, analyzing it like archaeologists brushing dust off ancient relic. Some recognized the make, the craftsmanship. Some recognized that this wasn't hobbyist equipment. This was legacy gear, passed down, maintained, used by someone who understood craftsmanship over flash. Still, the show had to go on. They lined up another SWAT shooter, this one younger, cockier, sunglasses perched on his head like a billboard for insecurity. He performed for the cameras, swinging his rifle like a prop, adding unnecessary flourishes to his reloads, overcorrecting his aim to impress the influencers lining the edge of the event. His shot went wide, missing the target by inches, but it didn't matter. The cheering drowned out the miss. The performance was the product now, not the accuracy. The bullet didn't have to hit the mark. The applause had to hit the sponsors. She could smell the difference. Real shooters didn't play with their weapons like toys. They didn't perform flourishes. They breathed, focused, pressed, released, followed through. This was theater, bad theater, and it smelled like old grease paint over mold. It didn't bother her, not in the way they hoped. It only confirmed what she already knew. She wasn't up against soldiers. She was up against salesmen playing dress-up. One of the maintenance men near the bleachers shifted his weight awkwardly, stealing glances at her. He recognized something, though he didn't have the words for it yet. Maybe it was the way she handled the rifle without looking down, how her grip was firm but not possessive, how her stance didn't broadcast power but absorbed it. Some of the crowd began to whisper, fragments of rumors moving like thin smoke through the bleachers. She used to be military, I think, or no, she's someone's widow, here for revenge, or that's one of those old target rifles, like the ones in national competitions 20 years ago. The details didn't matter yet, but the momentum was shifting, molecule by molecule, crowd energy like a tide starting to feel the gravitational pull of something they couldn't name. And still, she said nothing. Let them wonder. Let them talk. Let them try to shape her story into something they could understand. The real story was coming, and it didn't need explanation. It only needed execution. She caught sight of the lead instructor finally noticing the crowd shift. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, the practiced smile starting to falter under the weight of something he couldn't fully grasp yet. His career had been built on managing narratives, keeping lies polished, dressing atrocities in medals and formal statements. But this wasn't the battlefield he was trained for. This was public, uncontrolled, raw. No rehearsals. No script supervisors. Just raw nerves exposed for everyone to see. He barked an order to one of the event organizers. Something about moving the schedule along, minimizing her screen time, reshuffling the shooting order. Too late. The signal had already gone out. The crowd wanted to see what she could do now, not what the others could pretend to do. She could hear the uncertainty in the instructor's next announcement. His voice was still steady, but the words came just a little faster, like someone realizing they'd started a story they couldn't finish. The easy humor was gone now. Now it was about control, regaining authority, dragging the spectacle back into something safe, something explainable. But nothing about this moment was going to be safe for them. What they hadn't realized yet was that this wasn't her disruption of their show, this was her show. They just hadn't received the invitation yet. And when her turn came, when her name, bare and unfamiliar, was finally called, it wouldn't matter what they said about her before that shot. It wouldn't matter what jokes they tried to revive or what edits they tried to splice into highlight reels later. That single shot, waiting like a pressure fracture in a glass pane, would split their entire narrative into shards too sharp to gather again. They had underestimated the silence. They didn't understand yet that silence wasn't absence. It was containment. It was potential energy waiting for release. And when that release came, it wouldn't be loud. It would be clean, efficient, undeniable. Just like her. The call for her turn came late in the afternoon, when the sun was low enough to cast long, stretching shadows across the firing range. By then, most of the audience wasn't paying attention to the competition anymore. They were watching her. The instructors tried to keep the mood light, tried to recover some sense of control, but the crowd had shifted, leaning forward with a curiosity that wasn't entertained by antics or practiced reload. They wanted to see if the quiet woman with the old rifle was as dangerous as the tension suggested. She didn't hesitate. Moving with the certainty of someone who had practiced this exact moment in her mind 1,000 times, she stepped forward, unzipping the duffel bag in one smooth motion. No wasted movement. No showmanship. The rifle came out like it belonged in her hands, like it was an extension of her forearm. The stock was worn smooth by years of handling. The steel was slightly dulled from time but carefully maintained, oiled in the right places, the bolt action polished and silent. Someone in the crowd whispered about the model, guessing its age, its heritage. The online chats that had once been filled with mockery shifted to technical debates and speculation about her background. A slow avalanche of attention gathering weight. Even the younger recruits stopped talking now, their swagger dissolving under the sheer gravity of the moment. The range was marked by a target positioned at a distance so long most amateurs wouldn't bother wasting ammunition on it. A metal disc, barely visible to the naked eye, swinging slowly in the slight afternoon breeze. Earlier contestants had tried and failed, their misses punctuated by embarrassed shrugs and manufactured jokes to keep the mood light. But this wasn't that kind of moment anymore. The rifle sat perfectly in her shoulder pocket. Her left hand steadied the forend, fingers curled just enough to guide but never tense. Breathing controlled, not forced. She didn't need pep talks or counting rhythms. This was older than technique. This was memory working through muscle. Her cheek settled against the worn wood, her eye behind the iron sights. Not scopes, not magnifiers, not laser assistance. Just metal, breath, and calculation. No one spoke. The silence was no longer hers alone, it belonged to the entire space now. Even the lead instructor fell quiet, the microphone lowered slightly as if speaking would break the fragile, electric tension holding the scene together. She didn't rush the shot. No one trained properly does. The first breath was taken, not to calm, but to calculate. Humidity, wind drift, temperature, barrel alignment. All of it stacked behind her vision like transparent pages in a diagram sliding into perfect alignment. Her finger rested against the trigger, not curling, just there, like the presence of a loaded truth waiting for release. Somewhere far off, a camera zoomed in on the target, broadcasting its slow movement, the tiny shimmer of sunlight catching on its surface, making it seem almost impossible to define against the background blur of trees and sky. The voice came again, soft, from memory, not outside, but deep within, layered like an echo in a hollow chest. The voice that had barked orders the day her life came apart, now replaying itself on loop, not in accusation, but in preparation. This wasn't a ghost whispering to her. It was an unfinished sentence waiting for punctuation. Trigger squeeze. No drama. No flourish. Just a click, a sharp controlled report, and the distinct metallic crack from downrange that followed a full second later as the bullet found its mark dead center. Not high, not low, not near. Dead center. A full second of silence followed before anyone reacted, a collective intake of breath like the ocean sucking back before a tidal wave. The metal disc spun violently on its hanging chain, the impact hole perfectly centered like a black dot drawn with surgical precision. Gasps came first, then shouts, then the digital tidal wave as livestream comments erupted. Screenshots of her grip, her stance, the precise moment the trigger broke. Technical analysts started drawing diagrams midstream, explaining why that shot was not luck. It was calculation, execution, mastery. The lead instructor dropped the microphone. Not deliberately, he just forgot it was in his hand. His eyes fixed on the target, on the evidence that someone outside his carefully controlled world had just broken through the illusion he had built. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The failure was written across his jaw, his tight shoulders, the way his perfectly creased pants suddenly looked ridiculous next to her worn jeans and scuffed sneakers. The SWAT recruits didn't speak either. Their bravado, their jokes, their sunglasses, their practiced social media gestures all fell flat, unimportant, juvenile. They had been outshot, publicly, undeniably, by someone they had mocked moments before. There was no salvaging this moment for them. One of the younger tech assistants running the live broadcast whispered something to a colleague, eyes wide, the recognition dawning like sunrise. This wasn't just a shooting competition anymore. This was a reckoning unfolding in real time. As the disc settled, spinning slower and slower, the echoes of the shot still felt in the bones more than the ears. She stepped back, lowering the rifle without triumph or arrogance. No victory dance. No self-congratulation. Just the steady return of the weapon to its case, like a professional cleaning up after a job done to standard. What none of them saw was that it wasn't about winning the competition. It never was. Winning was the disguise. The target wasn't the metal disc downrange. It was the narrative itself, punctured through the heart with one undeniable truth. Even before the applause started, even before the influencers scrambled to reframe the event, even before the officials behind the scenes began frantically calculating how to spin this into a story they could sell, she knew the real work had begun. Not just here in the arena of controlled sport and scripted bravado, but out there, where the echoes of that shot would travel further than sound, further than commentary, further than likes or reposts. One perfect shot. One perfect crack in the lie. And the fractures spreading now were going to be impossible to contain. The silence after that shot wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a living thing, curling through the space, threading itself into every corner where pride used to sit. The applause that finally came wasn't immediate or enthusiastic. It was hesitant, nervous, like people clapping at a funeral when someone makes an inappropriate joke. The first few hands struck together in uncertainty, and then, as if the crowd needed to prove to themselves they hadn't just witnessed their entire reality crack, the noise gathered momentum, becoming a forced cheer, the kind politicians hear at rallies, the kind desperate leaders mistake for genuine loyalty. But underneath it all was the unmistakable discomfort of knowing that something larger than a competition had just unfolded before them. She didn't pay attention to the applause. Applause was for performers. She wasn't performing. She was making a point. And that point had landed like a hammer blow on the carefully curated public image of every person responsible for this event. More importantly, it landed like a buried memory waking up in the mind of the one man who hadn't yet spoken, the lead instructor. He stood there staring at her, the muscle in his jaw twitching, not from anger but from recognition. He had seen that rifle before. Not the make, not the model, but that exact one. The scratches were in the same places. The discoloration near the barrel from an amateur bluing attempt done by someone who didn't quite know what they were doing. It had been years, but not enough to erase the details from someone who paid attention to survival. The realization crawled through him like cold water pouring down the back of his neck. He looked at her face now, not as a nuisance, not as a disruption, but as a ghost dragging itself across the polished floor of his future. He remembered the raid. The screaming, the orders barked, the justifications crafted later in formal statements about insurgency threats, about securing communication assets, about following orders. The paperwork had been neat, the press briefings cleaner, and the promotions that followed had paved the rest of his career. He had counted on one thing remaining true forever: silence. Silence from the village. Silence from the surviving family. Silence from the statistics compiled neatly into footnotes buried in government archives. And now that silence had returned, not as a favor to him, but as a sentence passed. What unsettled him the most wasn't her skill, wasn't even the perfect shot. It was the fact that she hadn't said a word yet. Not once. As if words were beneath what needed to be communicated. She wasn't here for speeches. She wasn't here for television. She was here to pull memory into the present tense, and she had done it in a language older than politics: action. Behind the instructor, the officials in suits were already whispering, hands on earpieces, hurried conference calls in progress. The narrative was slipping. They had built this entire demonstration as a PR campaign. Showcase tactical readiness, boost recruitment numbers, sell a few contracts on the side. What they had now was a headline spiraling out of their control, hashtags forming like storm clouds on the horizon. "She's not on the competitor roster," one of the junior PR handlers whispered, panic rising. "Where's her sponsor? Who authorized her entry?" The truth, of course, was that she didn't need authorization. She had slipped into their carefully managed structure not by mistake, but by calculation. Every step she had taken to get here was deliberate. The event had open qualification slots to encourage community engagement. They never imagined anyone would seriously attempt them, certainly not someone without endorsements or tactical unit affiliations. The arrogance that had built their program was now the knife pressed against its own throat. One of the younger officers, stationed closer to the perimeter of the event, pulled out his phone, scrolling through older local news archives, hunting for her name, for some connection, for something that would explain why this woman, this nobody, could arrive and dismantle their credibility with a single squeeze of her finger. The deeper he scrolled, the paler his expression grew. He had found it. A small article, years old, buried in regional news, about a family caught in a mistaken raid, civilian casualties reported, no military discipline administered. Officially labeled a tragic intelligence failure. Names listed. Survivors noted. Among them, her name. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The instructors saw his face and knew the damage was done. Information has a way of moving faster than bullet trajectories once it finds the right hands. And the internet was full of the right hands. She stood there, rifle resting against her hip, not posing, not shrinking, simply existing in the full weight of what she was. She was no longer the curiosity of the crowd, not just the skilled underdog who outshot the professionals. She was now the living, breathing indictment of an entire system built on burying mistakes under classified documents and careful lies. It wouldn't stop with this shot. They all knew it. The instructors, the officers, the sponsors, they understood instinctively that what had happened wasn't just embarrassing, it was foundationally damaging. This wasn't just a headline for 24 hours of social media noise. This was going to lead to questions, investigations, public hearings. Other survivors of other forgotten mistakes might start speaking up. And even if they didn't, the perception of invincibility surrounding these operations had been shattered. Worse than exposure was the feeling of losing control, and that feeling now hung over the entire event like a fog no one could clear. She finally moved. Not to speak, not to explain, but simply to pick up the spent casing from the floor. It gleamed slightly in her palm, still warm from the shot, still humming with the energy of what it had just undone. She slipped it into her pocket like someone folding up an old photograph and tucking it into a wallet. Not a trophy, not a souvenir. Just a piece of a story, a sharp edge of unfinished history made final by her own hand. The instructor finally opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Sorry? We were following orders? Mistakes were made? None of it would land. None of it would matter. In that space, the truth stood silent. And silence had never been heavier. The story broke before anyone could stop it. A single journalist in the crowd, younger than most, sharp enough to catch the tremor in the instructor's hands and the sudden panic in the officials' voices, had already uploaded the comparison shots. The image of her face next to an old grainy photo of a child standing in the rubble of a broken home, barefoot, holding a blood-smeared cloth, eyes empty but aware. The caption was short, brutal, undeniable. Survivor of government raid outwings national elite in public shooting competition. Within minutes, it spread. The hashtags didn't need clever phrasing. The truth, raw and ugly, didn't need decoration. People responded to injustice faster than they responded to entertainment when you showed it without filters. The officials knew they were finished before the evening traffic had even begun outside the stadium. She didn't care about the broadcast. She hadn't done this for their cameras. She had done it for that voice, the one that still barked orders in her memory, the one now standing across from her in flesh, aging but unmistakable. His posture had stiffened, his chin raised in an old instinct of command, but it was hollow. His hands betrayed him, twitching slightly as if his muscles were catching up to the realization that he wasn't in charge here anymore. He opened his mouth again, probably to lie, but her stare cut the words down before they had a chance to form fully. It wasn't anger in her expression, it was precision, the same calculation that lined up that impossible shot. She was lining him up now, not with a weapon, but with exposure. He glanced at the cameras, at the crowd, at the younger officers who had suddenly distanced themselves like men who realized they were standing next to a sinking ship. No one was going to save him. The hierarchy that had carried him here, promoted him, polished his image, was backing away fast. Public support evaporates at the first sign of moral rot, and he knew it. Still, his pride wouldn't let him collapse, not yet. Pride is a thick armor, but it cracks just like metal under the right pressure. A single sound from behind broke the tension. Someone had stood up from the back row of officials. Not an instructor, not a recruit, but one of the tech assistants, the young officer who had found her story online. His face wasn't hardened like the others. His posture wasn't rigid with military muscle memory. He looked like someone who hadn't yet chosen which side he wanted to be on, but watching her, he was making that decision in real time. "Tell the truth," he said, quietly at first, but with the unmistakable weight of someone finding the sharp edge of their own backbone. "Tell them what you did." The words hung there, fragile but sharp. Another officer, a woman with a service patch indicating a deployment history older than most of the room, crossed her arms. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Body language alone said it clearly. "We know. And we're tired of pretending we don't." The instructor's throat worked hard to form a reply, but his tongue failed him. The carefully curated lies he had carried with him for years suddenly weighed too much. This wasn't a courtroom where procedure could save him. This was raw. And the raw truth burns hotter than any scandal ever managed by spin teams. She stood steady, rifle still resting comfortably by her side. Her silence, once mocked, now owned the entire space. She didn't need a speech. The weight of the story carried itself, and her silence only sharpened its outline. The world didn't need her voice anymore. They needed his confession, and everyone knew it. His first attempt at speech was weak. We had orders." The tech officer's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Orders? That's what you're going with? Orders to murder civilians?" The instructor took a step backward, instinctively, realizing too late that the movement was weakness exposed. Every camera, every phone, every whisper caught it. The authority he had carried his entire professional life evaporated like smoke in a strong wind. But it wasn't over yet. She stepped forward, just one step, not aggressive but undeniable. Her gaze never wavered. The others had shouted. The others wanted admissions, apologies, explanations. She didn't. She wanted exposure. Exposure was cleaner than revenge, more permanent than apologies. Revenge satisfies for a moment. Truth dismantles entire systems. One of the camera feeds was already broadcasting to national media now. This wasn't just viral, it was systemic. News agencies that normally avoided stories about military misconduct were picking it up because of the undeniable footage of her standing, calm, composed, victorious, while the decorated officer in charge visibly crumbled under scrutiny. Even networks known for defending institutions were hedging their tone, unsure which way the political wind would shift. In the crowd, more junior personnel started moving toward her, not out of allegiance yet, but out of recognition. Recognition of something they didn't see often. Dignity without noise, strength without bravado, precision without ego. It was unfamiliar but magnetic. Finally, the instructor's defenses shattered completely, his voice breaking not from the pressure of media but from the far older, sharper weight of guilt left to rot too long in secret. "It wasn't supposed to go like that," he muttered. "It was supposed to be a quick action. They said the house was harboring." "No one cares," the young tech officer cut in, his voice no longer timid. "They lied to you, and you let them. And you made sure everyone who could have corrected it stayed quiet or disappeared." It was true. The files were starting to circulate now. Journalists had connected her family name to at least 3 other small incidents written off as intelligence failures, all signed off by the same few names. Patterns never stay hidden forever, not when someone forces them into the light. Still, she said nothing. This wasn't her moment to narrate. It was theirs, to confess or to collapse. Either way, she had already won. Her story was out. Her family's faces, long buried beneath excuses and denials, were now on screens across the country, accompanied not by pity but by recognition of injustice, the kind that doesn't fade in a 24-hour cycle. But there was something else unfolding beneath the media noise, beneath the rising tide of headlines and social posts. There was something changing in the room itself, a shift from individual anger to collective realization. The people who had stood silent before were now finding their voices, one by one, not to scream, not to chant, but to tell their own pieces of the broken stories they carried. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about how entire systems of power had been allowed to operate in shadows, unchecked, unchallenged, because people trusted uniforms more than they trusted their own memories. And now, those shadows were burning away under the harsh, beautiful simplicity of one undeniable truth punctuated by a single, perfect shot. One shot to wake them all up. One shot to tear open the quiet complicity that let people like him rise while the innocent were forgotten. One shot, not to kill, but to reveal. And the revelation was only just beginning. The fallout didn't take days. It didn't need time to simmer. It was immediate, raw, and uncontrollable. Every major outlet carried it before the sun fully set that evening. What was supposed to be a harmless, entertaining marksmanship event to boost recruitment and confidence had instead become the focal point of a national reckoning. The irony, brutal and sharp, was that it had all started with a simple demonstration of skill, not a protest, not a lawsuit, not a petition. One perfect, undeniable act, sharper than any spoken accusation, had done more to break the illusion than entire teams of legal experts or politicians ever could. She didn't need to stay for the aftermath. The weight of the moment didn't require her supervision. The truth had its own momentum now, and it didn't care for permission or restraint. She collected her things in silence, that same unbroken focus she'd carried through every step of the ordeal. No hurry, no shame, no triumph, just steady, quiet intention. Behind her, the lead instructor had folded into himself, surrounded by cameras, microphones, and the brutal, jagged awareness that the uniform he wore no longer granted protection. People were no longer nodding at his words. They were dissecting them. The practiced confidence he had carried into so many interviews before had been gutted in real time, not by angry activists or shouted slogans, but by a single demonstration of skill wrapped in history's most inconvenient truth. And for the first time, the system wasn't protecting him. His sponsors wouldn't return his calls. His handlers stood with clenched jaws but offered no rescue. Every word he spoke was instantly compared to the growing pile of documents flooding online feeds, evidence of cover-ups, signatures on classified orders, testimonies from former soldiers who had been ordered into raids they didn't fully understand but were too afraid to question. His empire of credibility was dissolving under the weight of his own carefully hidden history. But she didn't stay to watch him collapse. His fall wasn't her purpose. Her purpose had been met when that shot struck the center of the target, not because it embarrassed him, but because it cracked open a sealed vault of denial that no official statement could repair. That one impact had carried the weight of 1,000 voices silenced over decades by the machinery of state secrecy. Now, those voices weren't whispers anymore, they were shouts echoing through headlines, through furious comment sections, through late-night anchors demanding accountability on live broadcasts. Outside the venue, protests began to form, not of angry mobs but of silent groups holding photos of other victims, other raids, other names erased by mistakes written in official ink. They weren't carrying torches or signs. They were carrying faces. And faces are harder to ignore than slogans. The collective weight of human memory has a way of breaking through bureaucratic walls that statistics can't defend against. Still, she didn't look back. Some battles don't need witnesses. Some victories are quieter than the wars that create them. By the time she reached the edge of the parking lot, her phone was vibrating repeatedly, messages she didn't bother to check yet. She knew what they were. Journalists asking for interviews. Activists wanting her to speak on camera. Politicians scrambling to offer solidarity now that the tides had shifted and they smelled opportunity. But she hadn't come here to become a symbol or a headline. Symbols could be twisted. Headlines could be reshaped by editorial boards. She came here for something cleaner, simpler. Closure isn't theatrical. It's not something you parade. It's private, sharp, unfinished to anyone outside of it. It doesn't play well in headlines. That's why so few people ever find it. She didn't feel better. Not in the way movies sell revenge or the way speeches package triumph. Closure doesn't feel good. It feels empty in a necessary way, like setting down a heavy bag you've carried too long. Your arms still ache, your shoulders still hurt, but at least now you can breathe in full again. And that's all she wanted. One breath fully drawn, not caught on memory anymore. The news was spinning wild. Some anchors called her a hero. Others framed it as a tragedy exposed too late. Some tried to pivot the narrative into questions about national security vulnerabilities, like they could redirect the conversation toward safer ground. But most people knew better. The clip of her lifting the rifle, breathing steady, lining up the impossible shot, that image spoke louder than the anchors did. And it was spreading everywhere, faster than their defenses could contain. Even the more cynical commentators couldn't help but admit the symbolic power of it. A lone civilian, unarmed by institutional support, dismantling the polished image of elite forces with nothing more than discipline, memory, and absolute clarity of purpose. And behind that, the darker, sharper truth: she wasn't alone. She was just the first who refused to stay silent. By the end of the night, congressional offices were issuing statements of concern, hinting at hearings, investigations, accountability. The president's press secretary fumbled through questions about systemic failures and public trust, each response weaker than the last. But all of it was noise compared to that single, crisp moment of a bullet striking center mass on a target no one else could touch. And while the world spun into reaction mode, she simply walked. One of the junior officers caught up to her near the outer fence, breathing hard but not from exertion. From realization. He didn't speak at first, walking alongside her for a few steps like someone standing near a fire they weren't sure how to describe. Finally, he found the words. "You could have done worse," he said quietly. "Nobody would have blamed you." But she just glanced at him once, steady, direct, not harsh, not forgiving, just steady. And with that one glance she answered 1,000 unspoken questions at once. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about weight being placed where it belonged. Precision, not chaos. Truth, not spectacle. Behind them, sirens wailed, not in panic, but in bureaucracy rushing to contain what could no longer be contained. Somewhere in those conference rooms, they were already writing draft apologies, lining up fall guys, preparing statements about reform. But she knew the truth before they did. Reform doesn't start in offices. It starts in exposure, in fractures, in someone daring to break the choreography of polite complicity. And that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't said a word, but her silence was now the loudest voice in the country. And it was only getting louder.